Hi everyone. In this tutorial, I'm going to be talking about how to build actions. Actions are scripts that we can record that can help us automate a lot of the redundant tasks that we do on a day-to-day basis in our post-production in Photoshop. So to begin with, I'm going to create a new action for what I consider a real basic color correction. So here I have an image that I made several years ago that clearly doesn't have the best color correction. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a color correction action that goes through some real basic steps. You'll notice if your action palette isn't available, just go to Windows and open up your action palette, and you'll see that you've got some default actions here. And here I have some other actions that I've downloaded from other sources such as Google's Nik plugin, and have some actions there as well. But what we're going to do is create a new set of actions that are going to be just for my post-production. I'm going to call this action set my post-production because they're just things that I'm going to use. Okay? So now I have my new post-production area here, and I'm going to create a new action. And I'm going to call this basic color correction. And I'll give it a color so that it stands out, and I think red's a nice one to have it stand out, and I'll hit record. The first thing I'm going to do with my new action is I'm going to create a curves adjustment layer. And this is where I'm going to let the technology help me out. And I'm going to option click on the auto. And I'm going to go through some of these auto corrections in here. And I think the best one is the find dark and light colors, because what that does is it finds the lightest color values and the darkest color values and brings them to a neutral. And that does a pretty nice job. Okay. And we can take a look real quick at the before and after, and you'll see that it took some of the color correction and did a pretty decent job of it. The next thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to adjust for the fact that this is a overly bright scene, and in fact this is a great example of the limitations of film or digital photography, and that the camera doesn't record the full dynamic range very easily, because the human eye sees so much more than what the camera can record in one exposure. So what I'm going to do is make another curves adjustment layer. And I'll just call this a highlight burn. And I'm just going to click on the highlight part, and I'm just going to bring that down a little bit. And now I'm going to go ahead, and you'll see that all my adjustment layers have a layer mask, and I'm going to actually go to Image and Apply Image. I'm just going to apply the background image to my layer mask, and you'll notice that what that did is it allowed the highlight details to come in without darkening up the shadows. Okay? And you'll just really pay attention in here that it really brought out some more texture detail in here. And this is just a real basic adjustment here. The next thing I'm going to do is a great little trick that will allow the colors to separate a little more clearly. And that is going to be to go to New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to do a black and white adjustment layer. But here's the trick on this. I'm not going to use the normal mode, which would turn my image to monochrome. I'm going to tell it to just use luminosity as the blend mode. And what that will do is keep my image in color, but it allows me to explore a lot of different options on how I adjust my color. There's the green channel. I've got lots of different options here. And so I'm just going to go ahead and set it as the default to begin with. And that's going to give me a real nice basic color separation. Now this particular image has a shift in the shadows, and you'll notice that the shadows have a particular blue. And so the last thing I'm going to do for my basic color correction script is I'm going to use a new adjustment layer and use the color balance, because what that allows me to do is it allows me to make adjustments to different portions of the image. And so I can select my shadows in here and make some adjustments there. Now, I'm not going to actually make any adjustments for this action, because this is going to be a step that I take on a image by image basis based upon what color shifts I might run into in my various images. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to hit the stop button on my action. And you'll see now that I have my basic color correction action right here. And I'm just going to go ahead and close this image out, and I'm not going to save it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reopen this image so that we can see how this action works. So there's my raw image, which is kind of blown out in the highlights, but it has good shadow detail. And here's the neat thing. I'm going to change my action palette to button mode. And you will see that in my button mode, I now have a red action button for my personal action that I've just created. And all I have to do is click on that action, and it's going to complete all those steps that I recorded. Now, what I like about this is I still have a non-destructive editing here that allows me to go into any of these adjustment layers I've created and make custom adjustments for this particular image. But it really just set up the default settings that I would use or want to use in any sort of basic color correction. Okay, so now I'm going to go in and make my individual adjustments, and one of the adjustments I'm going to make is in my black and white layer, where I'm going to pull the red brick down a little bit darker, and see how that just really enhances that image just a little bit better. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my color balance layer and click on that, and I'm going to go to my shadow values, where I see quite a bit of blue, maybe even a little bit of cyan on there, and I'm going to warm that up to blend in just a little bit with my highlights in here, and I'll just pull in a little bit more red and see how that just really neutralizes those shadows and make them much more believable. So there you have it as a basic color correction action that I can use and still keep all my adjustment layers so that I can make individual adjustments for any particular image I'm working on. The next thing I'm going to do, though, is now that I have this action created, I'm actually going to add a new action that's going to do something that is really special in Photoshop, which is to create a smart object. So the next thing I'll do is I'll go up to my Actions palette, and I'll get out of button mode, and I'm going to create a new action. Actually, I'm going to be more descriptive about it. I'm going to call this Create Smart Object. So it's just going to tell me that this action is just when I am ready to convert my layers into a smart object. And I'll go ahead and hit record. Oh, I'm going to make that another red one so that it stands out. These are my personal post-production actions. And I'll hit record. So now I'm going to click on the background layer, and then I'm going to shift click all my layers and go up to my layers palette, and I'm just going to say convert to smart object. Now what's exciting to me about this is I now have a single layer that if I go ahead and want to add an additional camera raw filter, I'm able to do this in a completely non-destructive manner. So I could go into camera raw, and I'm going to say that this image could be enhanced just a little bit more in terms of its overall color balance. So I'm going to use the color eyedropper tool, and I'm going to grab something in the frame that should be fairly neutral in the mid-tone values. And I'm going to actually neutralize that color cast just a little bit, and then I may back that off just slightly. I'm going to open up my shadows just a little bit, and I'll pull my highlights down just a little bit. just keep the details there. So now I've just done an extra modification to that image, and what's going to be neat about this is that that is no longer a destructive editing filter, rather it is a smart filter on a smart layer, and I can turn that on and off and see the before and after and see how I brought out more detail in here. I neutralized the color cast here, and because I now have a smart layer, I can double click on this smart layer and watch what happens. It has opened up my original layers in a document called Color Balance 1 PSB, which the PSB is that it's a Photoshop smart layer that's reopened up here, and I could make some adjustments in here. Let's say I wanted to just replay with my highlights just a little bit and maybe cool those off or get rid of some of the green cast that I see in there. And I could just go ahead and just make a little bit of tweak there. Once I've saved and closed, that change is now reflected back in my original document in here. Now I don't like the name that it selected, as it just kind of selected that. I'm just going to call this the original file here. But now I have an action, and you know what? I went a little extra in my steps here, so I'm going to show you something really important about actions, is that I'm going to hit the stop button, and I'm actually going to go back and edit this because I made a big mistake here, and this is probably a good thing for you to see. Is I didn't remember to stop my action, so I'm actually going to go back to my Smart Object action, and I'm going to go all the way back to here and throw that step out. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and shift click all these steps and throw those out. And I'm going to throw all those out. Everything after the smart filter where I got a little carried away, I'm going to throw that out, so that what's nice about when you're editing an action, you can actually see what the steps are and go back and delete them if you don't want to use that particular step. So now let's go ahead and go into our button mode again, and let's test out our two. Now we have two new red post productions. One is my basic color correction, my other is to create a smart object. And let's apply this to another image. So here's an image that I took many years ago that just reminded me of my childhood, because when we moved up from Los Angeles to Spokane, Washington, we ended up heating our home with wood. And I just think that this is such a beautiful reminder of childhood and an autumn day and the white picket fence and the Americana associated with that. I just love working with this image. So I'm going to go ahead and test our new actions out. And the first ones I'm going to test is the basic color correction. And there it applied that, and let's just turn those layers off and see what the before and after is. And you can see that did a pretty darn nice job on that. And then I might go ahead and play with the color balance in the shadows again, just because they tend to be a little cool. I might actually warm that up a little bit just to neutralize that. And that looks pretty good. So now the next action I'm going to test is our smart object. And I'll go ahead and click that, and it's created a smart object, and then I'm going to go ahead and just call this original. And in fact, before I do that, I'm actually going to go ahead and undo that smart object action. I'll create the smart object, but now I'm going to go into my editing part, and I'm going to actually click on this action, and I'm going to add to it. I'm going to hit the record button again, and I'm going to double click on this layer, and I'm going to call this original image smart object. Boom. And I'll hit the stop button. So now let's just go ahead and try this all one more time. Here we are back to my original file, and I'm going to go back to my button mode, and I'm going to hit my basic color correction first, and see how that did a really nice job of that. And then I'm going to hit my Create Smart Object. You'll notice it's named that layer the way I'd like to name it, so I can keep track of this is the original image. So I can keep track of that this is an original image as a smart object. So here are the first two actions that we're using to customize our tool palette in Photoshop to make post-production a lot more efficient. So let's try out these new actions on some other colorful images. Here's another image. I'll apply the basic color correction. And you can see it brought in a little bit more detail in. And I can actually go ahead and adjust my highlight burn layer a little bit more. I'll click on this and I'll go ahead and bring the highlights down even a little bit further. And that's looking pretty good to me. Now I'm actually going to go into my actions, and this is where you, as you start working with your actions and you start really thinking about it, about how can I systemize and improve my productivity, you'll make some edits to some of these actions. So I'm going to get out of our button mode here, and I'm going to go to my basic color correction. And I'm going to hit the record button because I'm going to add one more step. And that is, I'm going to select all these layers that I've just created, and I'm going to go to Layer and Group Layers, which is Command G, so that now I can hit the stop button here. And now I have this before and after that allows me to very quickly see that, wow, that action really did a nice job of enhancing that image. So let's go to another image, and this time it's a people shot that I did, one of my favorites actually. And I'm going to go ahead and apply our basic color correction. Clicked on that action. So now you notice this action is updated to include this extra step of grouping all my adjustment layers into a group. And in fact, let's go ahead and go back into our normal edit mode, and let's add another step here to this action. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the record button, and I'm going to double click this and call this my basic color correction layers. And then I'll hit the pause button here. So now I've added that extra step that I'm just refining as I go to figure out what's really going to make sense and work for me. Not only are these action step enhancements going to help me, but they're also going to help me document my process should I bring in an employee that I want them to understand the automated steps a little bit more clearly. So let's take a look at it before and after. You can see that that's a very warm image, and that did actually a pretty good job of neutralizing the color balance. But now I'm going to go ahead and make a little bit of enhancement here, and I'm going to click on my color balance, and I'm going to the highlight area here, and I'm going to add a little warmth back into this skin tone because I want to just warm that up just slightly. And again, those are the subtle adjustments I'll be able to make. But now that I have everything set up, it's really automated. Now that I'm happy with my basic color correction, I'm going to go ahead and take my next action, which is to create a smart object. So now I'm going to revert back to our original image here, and I'm going to go ahead and step by step go through both my actions. So I'm going to go ahead and hit basic color correction, and you'll see that it did the basic color correction. It grouped them the way I wanted it. And now I'm going to open up and do a little bit of tweaking on my color correction adjustment layer here. Go into my highlights. I'm going to add a little bit of warmth back to the skin tone a little bit. And I can turn my grouping on, off, and you can see that just really has done a nice job overall on that. I'm going to select that. And now I should be ready to run my Smart Object script, but I notice I've changed how that is working. So I'm going to actually edit this script. I'm actually going to create a new script. Get out of button mode. I'm going to create a new script because I think this one is going to be a little more accurate. I'm going to create a new action and create Smart Layer update. I call this the red color, create smart layer from group. That way it explains that I'm creating a new, when I've created a grouping like this, I'm going to go ahead and use this smart action instead. And it's just a subtle variation. And so I'm going to select my background layer, I'm going to select my grouped adjustment layer, and I'm going to go ahead and go to create smart object, convert to smart object, and then I'm going to rename this layer and call this original image smart object. And I'll hit the stop record button. And now you see that here is my basic color correction. Here's my original create smart object. Here's my new create smart layer. And I'm actually going to take this old one, and because I've refined my actions a little bit, I'm going to actually delete that one. And let's just go ahead and hit OK. And now let's take a look at how this is working with some other images. So as I go through this process, I'm figuring out little tweaks to my system that's going to work for me. What we want to do is build a systemized approach to image editing. So I'll go ahead and close this image. Here's another color image that we will just attempt to play our actions and see how we're doing. So first I'll click on the basic color correction. And I'll look at it before and after because I always want to double check, and I'd say, you know what, that did a really nice job. In fact, I'm really excited about how that luminosity black and white layer really did a great job of bringing out the yellow. Let's turn that off and see before and after, and just see how that just really separated the color and the bus in this area here really quite nicely. And then now I'm ready to create my smart layer. And now I have my original image smart object right there, just as I programmed it. So that worked extremely well. I'll save that. Here's another image that has a bit of a color cast to it. It was taken at a dusk evening time of day. Let's just go ahead and do our basic color correction. Take a look at that. Let's take a look at before and after. And you'll see it really brought out some greens on this particular image, and it really mapped the colors quite lovely. But I'm not happy with the overall cyan effect in the skin tone, so I'm going to go ahead and adjust that by bringing back some red in my highlights. And you just see how that warmed that back up really quite nice. I might even add a little bit of yellow back into that image. And now we can look at our grouping. There's before, there's after, and just see the huge difference. That was so quick for me to be able to do that. Now I'm ready to go ahead and create my smart layer from group action. And now I have my smart layer. I can save that, and I'd be ready to go on with some additional retouching. I definitely need to work on this little shadow that's coming down here, but that's another story. So here's a window light portrait that I'm going to try my basic color correction technique with. And that kind of opened that up and neutralized it. Again, I think it's done a pretty okay job, but I'm going to go ahead and open up my color correction. And this is interesting because, you know, the human eye can make relative adjustments quite accurately. And so I'm going to add a little more warmth back into that skin tone, just a little bit. But I really like the cool shadow. So in this case, I'm going to go into my shadows and maybe cool those off a little bit. And then I'll go into my midtones and highlights and open up a little bit more red there. So there's our before and our after, and that's looking pretty good. And I can go ahead and hit my smart layer. So here we can look at before and after. The image on the left is after I've applied my post-production scripts, and the image on the right is the before. And you can see it's quite a marked improvement, I think. There's another before and after of using the automated scripts. You can see the image on the left is before, and here's the image on the right, and it did a really nice job on that. Here's another before and after of our color correction script. The image on the left has a really yellow cast to it. Here we've really got nice neutral values in the sweater, and yet we've kept really nice skin tones in here as well. Here's another before and after. You see how blown out these highlights are, and my automated script brought in the highlights in, also brought in the detail and the concrete. And again, look at that. And it's all very automated, so it's working out really well for us. Let's look at one more image today, and here's an image that I think epitomizes your typical photographic excursion out in nature. It's a bright, high cloudy day. It's a bright contrasty scene, and so we're going to use our basic color correction script that we've created, and you'll see the before and after that did a really nice job of bringing in those cloud details. Okay, you'll notice that the greens are darkened a little bit before and after there, so I might want to open those up just a little bit. So I'll go to my black and white adjustment layer, and I will open up the greens just a little bit. Okay, and that works pretty well. I'm going to go ahead and say I'm ready to create a smart object, so I'll group those together using my script. Now I'm going to add a camera raw filter effect, and I'm going to do a pretty typical nature and landscape thing, which is to add a graduated neutral density to the sky. Get that even there. And in this case, I've just brought in the cloud and highlight detail. I could even lower the overall exposure just a little bit if I wanted to. And then I'm going to go ahead and go back to my default adjustments here, and I'm going to open up the shadows just a little bit. And I might enhance the contrast, or the clarity I should say, just a little bit as well. And then for the final effect, add a little bit of vignetting to this image, and I'll hit OK. And here you can see my smart filter allows me to go before and after. And here you can see in a very short amount of time, using the action buttons I've created, along with an additional camera raw filter that is being applied to a smart object, I'm actually able to use non-destructive editing to make major improvements to my images in a very efficient way. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.